Hi everyone, welcome to our last lesson here to wrap up the age of industry. So we're going to look at reforms that occurred in the age of industry for today. So our objectives and standards to explain labor and other reforms that took place and to summarize reforms and the struggles they may have faced. Take a moment here to read over the standards, please. And our desired results, what reforms came about during the Industrial Revolution? So we've already talked about this a lot, but just to kind of repeat a little bit, remember that factories were dirty places with dangerous jobs. Workers worked very long hours with very little rest. But by the 1800s, many workers began to press for reforms. They also formed voluntary groups known as unions that would protect and fight for their rights. So unions spoke for all the workers in a certain occupation. Could be a coal mine, could be a factory, could be somewhere else, protecting the workers that work somewhere. And they basically worked to bargain for rights between the workers and the employers. A lot of times they would push for things like higher wages or better working conditions. And if management or the people who own the factory or the coal mine refused these demands, workers could go on strike, or what is refusing to work. Now, unions are going to have some trouble getting reforms passed in Great Britain and the United States in the beginning. In fact, Great Britain actually outlawed unions and strikes when they were first formed, but workers still joined unions despite the threat of prison and being sent to prison for joining a union. And eventually, Great Britain would allow for workers to unionize again. So some labor reforms here. In Great Britain, they prohibited the hiring of children under the age of 9. Children from the age of 9 to 12 could not work more than 8 hours. Children from the ages of 13 to 17 could not work more than 12 hours a day. Women and children were not allowed to work underground. And then women and children in factories had to be limited to 10-hour workdays. In the United States, it took a little bit longer for some of these labor reforms to come to our country here, but people are going to work in the United States to end child labor, and eventually child labor will be banned in the United States as well. And many of these labor reforms you see in Great Britain, such as you can't allow a minor to work only so many hours. You can only do certain positions. Even when you go to apply for a job today, you can't be forced to work, and you can't be placed in a dangerous condition if you're under the age of 18. So many of those labor reforms are from Great Britain and do come over to the United States eventually as well. So the abolition of slavery, we talked about this a little bit already in class on Friday, but remember that William Wilberforce was a religious man and a member of Parliament in Great Britain, and he and others are going to lead the fight for abolition, or the end of the slave trade and slavery in the British Empire. Eventually, Parliament will pass a bill to end the slave trade in 1807, and Great Britain will ban slavery altogether, including in their colonial territories in 1833. Now, in terms of the United States, it's going to be a little bit more of a fight to end slavery, as you're probably aware. But the fight for abolition in the United States would take a longer time, and it also involved the U.S. Civil War. So I put a map here where you can see the blue states, or the Union states, are those against slavery, and then the red states, the Confederate states, which are those in support of slavery, and then the border states, which are kind of in between, and then the grayish color there, the territories. But again, I'm sure maybe you've learned some stuff about the Civil War before, so not to spend too much time on it, but eventually the northern states, or the Union states, will win the Civil War, and slavery will be abolished in the United States as well. But again, not till about 30 or so years later, after Great Britain had done so. Some other reform movements that come around are rights for women. Women workers also began to form groups for better wages and better working conditions. Remember, we talked about the Lowell women who actually kind of started their own union group to push for better wages and better working conditions, and actually forced the factory owners to kind of back down and give in to their demands. And other women are going to look to other reform areas, such as helping the poor or those in need. And another thing we're going to see is the rise of the women's right to vote movement, which we'll talk about later on down the road. But we'll begin to see the formation of women pushing to gain the right to vote in Great Britain, in the United States, and also elsewhere around the world as well. So some other reforms that come about during this time are education. Education was a big discussion for reform. Prior to this, people did not have the money to send their children to private schools, or maybe they needed their children to work in factories or in coal mines to help support the family. But Horace Mann is going to reform this system in the United States, and this will eventually spread around the world by promoting the idea of free public schools. And as you know, we have public schools today that are supported by taxpayer dollars, but you don't have to pay anything specifically to get in the door. Others are going to look to reform the prison system. Prior to this, prisons were seen as places as punishment and torture. To punish criminals, there was no real way to provide them any, rehabilitation or, positive outlook on life. So many prisons are going to reform around the country at this time to help prisoners be prepared to live happier lives upon their release. All right, so please try your best on the questions that follow and respond to this at the end. What reforms occurred in the age of industry? Again, what reforms occurred in the age of industry? Hope you have a good day or night, and I will hopefully talk to you soon.